Meanwhile, Britain is wading into the crisis in the country, promising the deployment of 100 additional British troops, taking the total number to 400 of British soldiers in the UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan. British Defence Secretary Michael Fallon says the additional troops will join the others to help reduce the number of soldiers there, helping to reduce the number of migrants fleeing poverty and war in Africa and in the Middle East, discouraging them from traveling to Western Europe. Just last month, the United Nations Security Council authorized the deployment of 4,000 strong protection force in South Sudan's capital, Juba, after several days of fighting involving tanks and helicopters between troops loyal to President Salva Kiir and those backing former Vice President Riek Machar.
Well, it's 400 British troops, so it will be quite a large number when they're all deployed, and they will be building a hospital unit which will be there for all future peacekeeping operations in South Sudan. And let's be clear why we're doing this. If you don't help keep these fragile states together, you end up with instability, with violence, with terrorism, and then you end up with mass migration. And you get people on the move, and they go on the move to Europe and set off on that very dangerous journey to Europe. So you need to deal with these issues further back. Well, first of all, we're deploying medics to build the hospital unit and an engineering regiment. And there will also be force protection. So the troops that we're sending will include a unit that will protect the other troops, if that's not too complicated. So they will be looking after themselves. But we hope they will make a difference and help bring some of the violence we've seen in South Sudan to an end.
Still on South Sudan, while a country is receiving all the attention right now from the international community, the United States, however, is not delighted about what's going on. They're not in support of Riek Machar's returning to the country as a means of ending the crisis in South Sudan. A U.S. Special Envoy to South Sudan, Donald Booth, says Mr. Machar's return would lead to more political instability. Mr. Machar and President Salva Kiir both signed that shaky peace deal about a year ago in August last year, but that has not succeeded in ending crisis in the country. Let's turn to Zimbabwe now. The ZANU-PF in the country has been accused of withholding food aid to areas occupied by opposition supporters. The country's Human Rights Commission said opponents of President Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF party had been told they would never get any food aid. Mr. Mugabe declared a state of disaster in February, with the government estimating that 4 million people would need food aid by January 2017. The allegations coming from a constitutionally established body are especially significant given the role food distribution plays in election campaigns in the country, and elections are coming up in Zimbabwe quite soon. Zimbabwe has endured 2 years of failed rains, with this year's problems linked to the El Nino weather pattern. The VOA's Adam Phillips is in New York. He's done extensive work on Zimbabwe's food crisis and the security problem in the country. Adam, thank you for joining us on Network Africa.
It's a pleasure.
How true are these reports about the ZANU-PF withholding food aid to supporters of the opposition?
I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble understanding you.
How true is the report that the ZANU-PF is withholding food aid to areas occupied by parties that are opposing President Robert Mugabe?
Well, I have not been there myself, so I can't verify it from a first-hand experience, but there are widespread reports that that is the case. Many of them are anecdotal. They haven't been, independently verified by reports that I've seen. But I tend to believe it, but I'm just, a pedestrian in that sense, like other people. I mean, I think that we will await word on how bad it is as far as that goes.
But is that a possibility? Is that something President Robert Mugabe could do?
Yes, well, it's the opposition groups. I mean, there's two different kinds of aid going on. There's the international aid, and then there's the government aid, government food aid that's been promised. And the reports that I've heard that are most egregious is that Mugabe's government and opposition groups is withholding aid to people that he feels are in sympathy with opposition groups, and they're withholding government food aid from those people as a threat. Either, go along with the program, my program, or we won't give you our government food. As far as the international groups go, I think that they might have some backdoors in, especially in the eyes of the international community. It's very bad PR to sort of block UN food groups from getting in.
There's been a drought in southern Africa affecting food production. How has Zimbabwe been coping with the worst drought in history here in Africa?
Well, it's very, very bad, and it's getting worse. Although I'm told that just to go through the countryside, you don't see, people with bloated bellies and that kind of thing. Although people have been selling off their cattle because the cattle is, rather than have the cattle die, they've been selling them off basically at giveaway prices. And so that speaks to the future in terms of their, even if the drought leaves, they won't have the cattle that they had before. It's very bad, and people are sort of clustering around in villages, sharing the food when they can. But things are looking quite dire, and if the drought continues, of course, it's going to be a humanitarian crisis of huge proportions. Millions of people are already affected.
And how dire is the country's security as it concerns food production?
I'm sorry, the connection is terrible. It's very difficult for me to hear you.
Yes, it must be. I do understand the network is a bit fuzzy today. But how does, let me rephrase that question, how does food security in Zimbabwe also affect security generally in the country?
How does food security in Zimbabwe affect food security outside the country? Is that what you said, or within the country?
Within the country. How does it affect security also within the country?
You mean security in terms of military security and other kinds of social factors that aren't directly involve food?
Yes.
Well, I mean, people are frightened. People are worried. Obviously, the closer the wolf gets to the door, as we say in America, the more tense it becomes, and the more likely the conflict will arise. And because there is a scarcity of resources and people are afraid, that's never a good recipe in terms of other kinds of security. People, get frightened enough for their families, and they tend to grab what they need. So then it becomes a question of the military and the police. They're also involved in changing sides and all that. So it makes the infrastructure more difficult. Petrol is harder to obtain. And generally it's terrible. If you don't have food, you don't have almost anything in some ways, including health. Schools are affected. People can't eat. Schools, and it's a catastrophe in the making, if it's not already here.
And is the UN intervening in what's going on in Zimbabwe?
I'm sorry?
Is the UN intervening in what's going on in Zimbabwe?
I can't report on that. I'm not sure. I don't know now.
Thanks again, Adam, for joining us on Network Africa. Climate change, rapid urbanization and unemployment remain critical challenges for African countries. Some of the leaders currently meeting in Nairobi, Kenya for the African Green Revolution Forum have agreed that agriculture offers solutions to some of these challenges, as our correspondent Ayola Kasim reports.
Africa currently represents a $300 billion food market that is projected to grow to $1 trillion by 2030. The continent spends between $30 to $40 billion annually on food import. How to turn the market in favor of Africa and more than 70% of its population who engage in agriculture is the focus of policymakers, experts, and other stakeholders in agri-sector who are gathered here in Nairobi for the African Green Revolution Forum.
The ticking time bomb debate.
The Kenyan president, in his keynote speech at the opening ceremony, asked African leaders to change their mindsets towards the agricultural sector.
Until this sector is transformed, our hopes of industrialization as a continent, and for us to have a flourishing manufacturing sector, will be a little more than a pipe dream.
His Rwandan counterpart says it is time for Africa to move beyond the rhetoric and just do it.
To make sure that we move from what we already know that needs to be done, what we repeat so much every day, to really doing something that brings this to fruition.
Sub-Saharan Africa's population is the fastest growing of any region in the world, and on track to reach 1.4 billion by 2030. To stay on course for food and nutritional security, agriculture experts say represents a solution if the African government could do better going forward.
We can see now that the hour has come for us to seize the moment. We are launching here the campaign for African agriculture. We want to make that big final push.
The leaders here in Nairobi are urging everyone to seize the moment by joining the efforts to ensure Africa's rise through agricultural transformation. Ayola Kasim reporting for Channels Television News.